This show is brought to you by Safety FM.
Over 25 years helping leaders reducing errors and incidents. Here's your host of the Essential Leadership Cycle podcast, Rob Fisher.
Hi, welcome to the next episode of the Essential Leadership Cycle podcast. I'm your host and intentional leader, Rob Fisher, coming to you from the ArrowHP.com studios here in the Fit Center for Excellence in Concord, North Carolina. In previous episodes, we discussed the process of the Essential Leadership Cycle and what each element means and how to think about it and use it. Today, I want to provide some specific guidance on what we call values-based engagements. You know, one of the guiding principles of human performance, human and organizational performance, is that organizational values drive individual behaviors. What we've seen over the years is that the small organizational values are always more impactful on the individual behaviors than the larger organizational values. I'll give you an example of that in a minute. A lot of companies have observation programs or processes where managers and first-line supervisors have a task to observe work to see if it's being done safely and have a conversation or coaching with individuals on the task and based on what the observer sees. That's great. Glad you do that. We call those method-based observations. Keep doing them if you do them, and keep gathering and analyzing the data and info that you get from them. Imagine how many method-based observations where you go out and watch work you would need to discover a values mismatch that you could improve to lead to better performance. You can go out and watch method. Now imagine that a few leaders go out and through values-based engagements discover a value mismatch that can be managed almost immediately. Because we all know that these value mismatches tend to drive different organizations to do things that may not match what you normally would want them to do. I want to shift your paradigm a bit to talk about values and how we know as leaders that the team and organization actually share in our values, mission, and vision. It's not a yes-no question. There's much more to it than that. Remember from one of the earlier episodes, I discussed the different ways individuals with different personalities share values. Some think that merely putting it out is sharing. We put it on a poster. We put it on the website. We tell people all the time. We send out safety bulletins. Others don't believe it's really shared unless they understand and agree with the concepts and methods described by the mission, vision, value, or goal. But how do we know if the organizational values that we've shared with our organization based on our personality tendency, we've shared it with our organization, the stakeholders, or even our shareholders, how do we know if they're really shared in such a way that we can assure ourselves that everybody gets it and their role in the values, mission, vision, and goals are understood and match? In other words, are we self and team aware of how people really feel about the values and how those feelings impact what they do and say in their work? Values-based engagements are conversations, not observations. You're not watching work. You're engaging with the workforce to understand what they think and know about a value, a mission, a vision, or a goal, and what they think your impact are on those. You're not there to watch work, but to have a conversation. Remember that smaller organizational values are more impactful than the large organizational values. Let me give you an example of this. Most organizations have some kind of organizational value or norm that they expect for people to follow procedures. And the workforce knows that we have procedures and we're expected to follow them. So imagine you go out and a workforce team is going to, say, repair a pump. And this pump is broken, and this pump broke about 8 years ago. But there's only one person on the crew that was around 8 years ago when this pump broke. So they go through your job safety analysis, job risk analysis, job hazard analysis, whichever one you use. They go through that process, and all the crew looks at that individual that was here 8 years ago and said, how did you do it? How was this done? Let us know what the process was. And they jot down and take notes on that process so it makes sense to them. Now, technically, they think they're in rule-based performance mode where there's a fairly low error rate, but they're probably actually in knowledge-based performance mode because this individual hasn't touched this component this way in over 8 years. But they very diligently go through the process with what they think or what they believe will happen and what they think or what they believe based on this individual's experience from 8 years ago they should do. That team fully believes that they are following your mission, vision, value, and goal of following procedures. They think they're doing the right thing, and they may very well be. But let's say that one of your senior leaders decides that day they're going to go out and do some management by stumbling through or management by walking around or whatever you call it. And what they decide to do is go to the maintenance department and say, tell me what work is going on out there so I can go and watch something that is interesting or unusual. And by the way, I want you to print out the procedure that they're supposed to be using so I can familiarize myself with it before I go out. That's always a good trait when you're going out to watch work, that the leader knows what they're about to go watch. When they do that, they discover that the work that's being done on this particular pump that was done 8 years ago, they actually wrote a procedure or a process or a work document on how that work should be done 8 years ago. The individual that was doing the work now didn't remember that happened. They were a new person 8 years ago, but now they're fairly seasoned. So the senior leader gets a printout of this work document and carries it out into the field. The senior leader gets out there and sees that the crew is performing the work on a fabricated 4 hours ago job safety analysis that technically went through the process, but was really what they believed should happen and not by the procedure that he's holding in his hand. Does he think that crew, or do they think that crew is meeting the value of following procedures? And the answer to that every time is no. So you have a values mismatch. The crew believes that they're meeting the organizational value of following procedures, but the senior leader believes that they're not because he sees that they have a procedure that he believes they should be following. When you see that mismatch, both of them think they're doing the right thing, thinking they're thinking the right way. That smaller organization, the crew interpretation of that value of following procedures may be different than the senior leaders think that it should be. So discovering those values-based engagements, discovering the values mismatch through values-based engagements becomes important, because if you saw that 2 or 3 times in the organization, then you could actually start acting on the values mismatch instead of just thinking, well, those workforce people, they just don't like following procedures. I will tell you from my experience, that is very rarely true, but very often said. Now, one thing to be careful of when starting values-based engagement, and here's a conflict alert. Only managers and above can do them successfully. So values-based engagements are limited to managers and senior leaders. But about 50% of a manager or senior leader's time in the field should be doing values-based engagements, the conversation about the values, mission, vision, and goals. The reason it has to be a manager or above is that the frontline supervisor or crew lead that we typically rely on for the majority of our observations are primarily responsible for creating, manifesting, and propagating the smaller organizational values. So they can't really see the values mismatch because it's their interpretation that is revealing itself in the behaviors of their smaller group or the smaller organization. Imagine if your neighbors go to the same church. They hear the same thing every Sunday. They have the same value set that is being told to them. But each family leader hears and interprets the values in their own way, and that manifests itself in how the family unit is run. Now, from the outside, you may look at these two families and notice the difference, but internally, it's much harder for them to see. So what can you do? Take one of your values or mission statements and go to the field and simply ask a few questions. Let's take something like life-saving actions. A lot of organizations have some variation of rules to love by or leave by, life-saving rules, save your life rules, golden rules. Just take those and go out and ask people to, number one, describe how these life-saving actions actually help prevent fatalities. And then listen to them. I think you might be surprised at what the answer is. Then ask the question, how does your supervisor or superintendent or general manager, or even better, how do I show you that we see value in these life-saving rules or actions? How much time do they talk about it? How much time do they express what they feel about it when they visit? How much time do they visit at all? And then third, tell me about the relationship between these save your life actions and other processes and tools, job safety analysis, standard operating procedures, work safety practices, safe work practices, incident analysis. Describe those and then listen to them. Recently, a management team did this and were shocked to find out that what the leaders thought the value of saving lives that was being used as interpreted was actually way off from how people thought about it. It opened up a dialogue, that's self and team awareness, that helped align the leaders and workforce, that shared vision and values, and push some changes in the way the values, mission, and vision were described in the organizational guidance. That's clear roles and processes. They saw improvement in all three driving elements almost immediately, which will ultimately result in significant improvement in resultant conditions, including trust, diversity and inclusion, commitment, accountability, and organizational learning. Until next time, this has been your host, Rob Fisher. Thanks for listening. And remember, intentional leadership starts with you.
The views and opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the host and its guest and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the company. Examples of analysis discussed within this podcast are only examples. They should not be utilized in the real world as the only solution available, as they are based only on very limited and dated open source information. Assumptions made within this analysis are not reflective of the position of the company. No part of this podcast may be reproduced, stored in a retrieval system, or transmitted in any form or by any means, mechanical, electronic, recording, or otherwise, without prior written permission of the creator of the podcast, Jay Allen.